Hi and welcome to a tour to Rodeløkka, a vibrant and special district of Oslo, the one that has preserved an authentic look and ambience of timber houses, little green backyards, blossoming palisades, green quiet gardens, cats, and cats. Join me for this tour and hear about the history of Rodeløkka, a relict village in the middle of Oslo. Not just in our time, but over the years, the wooden housing development at Rodeløkka has been described as a small village in the middle of Oslo. Much of the original street network remains intact, and the well over 100-year-old wooden houses are tucked away between older brick buildings and newer concrete structures, just a stone's throw from the traffic-heavy Carl Berners Plass. Rodeløkka is Oslo's most uniform old wooden house area, where few new buildings have been allowed to break up the core of wooden houses. A characteristic description of Rodeløkka can be found from the early 1970s, when most of the houses were deteriorating and the area was threatened with complete demolition. But that is not reflected in the following depiction. Among others, Gunnar Hearns wrote about Rodeløkka in his memoirs in 1970s. Rodeløkka has been compared to small towns on the southern coast of Norway, and not without a reason. Here are the same streets and alleys, not unlike Kittelson's motifs from life in the small scale. The walk leads into a maze of brown, red, and white houses along streets named after cities in the far north. In a small red cottage lived a man who kept pigs, chickens, and a cow, although that was some years ago. Now the courtyard is quiet. On one side of the street, a lovely house, well kept and relatively newly painted, with a decorative water pump in the courtyard. Not far away, on the same side, are dry cleaners with a piping system and a factory silhouette that must be at least a couple of generations old. The houses, more or less rebuilt and extended, are the same ones that stood there in 1870. The area around the northeastern part of Langata was called a piece of Lillehammer in the capital. Langata is Rodeløkka's most representative street, its Karl Johan, if you will. Here, the southern coastal character is clearly evident. We stop by a coffee roastery and a mechanical workshop. 3 men are at work with welding flames and machines. Originally, it was an old smithy. In the courtyard, there are trees, bushes, and other greenery. From Gunnar Hearns's book Walking Through Rodeløkka. Now, almost 50 years after this description, Rodeløkka's remaining wooden houses have been modernized on the inside and refurbished. Some have also been expanded or had extensions added, with approval from the city antiquarian. This practice was introduced when the municipality's demolition decision was overturned around 1980, and central Rodeløkka was designated for preservation, gaining the status of a special conservation area. Today, the neighbourhood appears well maintained and is a purely residential area, without the elements of small industry and shops that existed well into the 1990s. The area has become an idyllic residential suburb to Rodeløkka and other surrounding districts. The last remaining commercial buildings have been converted into housing, and only one discreetly located print shop still remains. Pastor Ruda and his summer house. Before 1860, Rodeløkka did not exist. Until 1854, this area was rural, and Dean Frederick Ruda, originally from Jørpen in Telemark, purchased part of the property from the Dalen Engine farm. With him, he brought a small wooden house that he set up on his new property. It was to be his summer house. When the wooden housing development later emerged, Ruda's house came to be located on the corner of Tramsagata and Vardagata, with the address Tramsagata 7. Former city antiquarian Arno Berg was fascinated by the house's architecture. The house is fantastically amusing, with a grotesque use of Gothic details combined with quite a bit of Baroque and a hint of Empire. A little over 100 years later, Ruda's house stood uninhabited and dilapidated in the shadow of a modern concrete building, and in the 1980s, it was moved to a better plot in the middle of Langata to make way for a new residential block. This relocation was arranged by the house's new owner, in accordance with a municipal clause tied to the sale of the house. The starting shot for the wooden town. The starting shot for the wooden town of Rodeløkka came in 1859, when Dean Ruda had to resign from his position. He then sold about half of his property to 3 enterprising blacksmiths. These were Hans Olsen from Vågå, Christopher Nilsson from Neatedal, a former weaponsmith, and Gundir Andersson from Hadeland. They parcelled out the area into smaller plots and began selling them in 1860. Yet this area came to be called Rodeløkka, after the dean. The blacksmiths quickly transformed Ruda's rural estate into a wooden town. By 1865, there were 141 inhabited houses in the area, with a population of around 1,700. 10 years later, the number of houses had risen to 150. Of these, 93 were single-story, 51 had 2 stories, and 6 had 3 stories. Between 1875 and 1891, the total number of houses rose to 217, with most of the new buildings having from 2 to 2.5 stories. In other words, the pace of construction in Rodeløkka's first 3 decades was remarkable. And the quality of the houses varied, something later renovators would come to experience firsthand. The assumption that old wooden houses are, by definition, well-built and sturdy turns out to be only partly true. Even in the 19th century, developers sometimes resorted to quick and cheap solutions, especially when the goal was to rent out or sell the property for profit. Good enough and cheap was an appealing strategy then as it is now. During this gold rush-like period of construction, the neighbourhood was given an alternative name, Vågaby. The name was proposed by General Major Paul Hansen Birch, who, like one of the blacksmith owners, came from Vågå. But despite the general's patriotic naming attempt, it was the name Rodeløkka that stuck with the public. Poor and criminal. The reason the suburb grew so quickly was the city expansion in 1859. In Christiania, now Oslo, there was a law requiring buildings to be made of brick or stone to prevent large fires, a regulation introduced in the 1600s after Oslo burned down in 1624 and was rebuilt under the new name Christiania. This led to a social divide. The well-to-do preferred brick houses and settled within Christiania, while those with less means lived outside the city in wooden houses, including in Rodeløkka. Wooden houses were cheaper to build than brick ones, but they had to be constructed outside the new city boundary, which in 1860 ran where Helgesens Gate is today. The developers at Rodeløkka probably realized they had to act quickly to get ahead of further city expansions. Their foresight was well-founded, as the next expansion came in 1878. By then, the wooden town was already well established and had to be accepted as part of the urban landscape. Neither Rodeløkka nor other new suburbs were looked upon kindly by the citizens or administration of Christiania. There was a desire to have them torn down altogether. The prevailing attitude was that people should either move into the city or return to where they had come from. The suburbs were seen as unsightly, and they also made the city harder to defend militarily. The city's merchants and craftsmen also disliked the new competition moving into the suburbs, setting up businesses in cheaper premises that gave them a competitive edge. The rest of the suburban population was, perhaps predictably, viewed with prejudice, seen as poor and criminal. Rodeløkka and other suburbs, then, emerged in defiance of the authorities' intentions, driven by individuals who couldn't afford to build within the city. As a result, the suburbs came to be regarded as low-status residential areas. Who inhabited Rodeløkka? Between 1860 and 1865, the 3 blacksmiths sold 81 building plots to 75 different individuals. Most of them, nearly 60%, were craftsmen, while the next largest group of traders, over 20%, consisted of various laborers. These included stonemasons, road workers, day laborers, messengers, a foreman with the railway, several dock workers, and so on. Cart drivers made up nearly 10% of the buyers, while merchants, clerks, and various members of the lower middle class, among them a cavalry captain, Johan Gabriel Lund, accounted for 8%. None of the craftsmen were masters, they were journeymen, manual laborers, or individuals of unspecified rank. Many worked in the building trades, carpenters, masons, and timber workers. The large number of construction workers may be explained by the fact that these were people who could build their own homes. While many of the first-time buyers likely lived in their houses, there was also speculative construction, intended for rental or eventual resale at a profit. A young population with many children. After its establishment in 1860, Rodeløkka quickly grew into a densely populated suburb. In 1891, 4,480 people lived there, likely the peak of its population. After that, the population steadily declined, reaching 3,033 residents by 1930. Considering that the total population of Christiania, what Oslo was called back then, in 1891 was just over 151,000, Rodeløkka's share was not insignificant. During the period 1875 to 1891, the city's population increased by about 55,000 people, more than a 50% growth. Naturally, this had a dramatic effect on the housing market, which makes it very understandable that those with limited means established suburbs like Rodeløkka without official approval. Statistical data from 1865 also shows that the population in new suburbs like Rodeløkka was younger than that of Christiania overall, and quickly became more child-rich. This is likely due to the fact that the city and its suburbs met different needs. The city offered a large job market, and single job seekers naturally wanted to live close to their place of work. The capital also served as a kind of marriage market for many young newcomers. After starting a family, securing housing became a priority. Newly married couples with modest means sought out suburbs like Rodeløkka, where affordable housing was available. Near movers and Swedes. All those mentioned in the historicals moving lists to Rodeløkka had rural backgrounds. In the second half of the 19th century, there was a significant surplus of population in rural areas, leading to considerable emigration. However, most of the newcomers to both the city and the suburbs didn't come from far away. Nearly half of all Rodeløkka's residents came from Precursors, including Acre. These were near movers from the city's outskirts. The rural surroundings and the wooden houses likely reminded them of the environment they had moved from, in contrast to the city with its brick houses. Even though they worked in the capital, they could return home to the countryside after work. It's likely that many of those moving from the countryside to the suburbs took their houses with them. Timber walls are common in Rodeløkka, and in the house where I live, Roman numerals are carved into the timber beams, upside down. This is an indication that the house was dismantled and reassembled, probably after the timber was transported by cart from another area in eastern Norway. Such a maneuver was probably not unusual in the 1860s and 70s when houses weren't as large. Another feature of Rodeløkka's early population was the significant percentage of people of Swedish origin. They made up about 11% of the population in 1865 and 12% in 1875. While foreigners in the city came from various nationalities, all foreigners in Rodeløkka seem to have been Swedish. The large percentage of Swedes could be attributed to the fact that they shared similar cultural and social backgrounds with the Norwegian rural-born people. Many came from the forested areas along the border and from the southwestern part of Sweden. The reason for emigration was also tight conditions at home. Small, cramped apartments. Modest statistical numbers indicate cramped living conditions in the suburbs, which are difficult for us to imagine today. In 1891, the population density in Rodeløkka was 20.6 people per house, which were generally small. Only 12% of the houses had fewer than 6 residents. The apartments were also small, many consisting of only one room. In 1891, there were an average of 3.4 people per room in Rodeløkka, which had the highest level of overcrowding. The average on Vålerenga was 2.9 people per room, and on Campen, it was 3.0 people per room. The main reason for this overcrowding was the lack of housing in the capital, where particularly landlords, who built houses with the intention of renting them out, were tempted to create many small apartments, sometimes only 1 or 2 rooms, where entire families had to live. Even homeowners had to take in renters or lodgers to alleviate a tight economy. There were many lodgers in Rodeløkka, the equivalent of modern-day rooming house tenants. It was also common for newlywed couples to live with one of their parents before they could afford to buy their own small place. While Rodeløkka in the 1860s appeared as a small house village, the area took on more and more the character of a rental housing environment in the 1870s and 80s. This trend continued in the decades that followed. One of Martinson's informants claimed that many of the houses on Rodeløkka were pure rental buildings, very few had their own house and garden. The children played in the street and in the yard on trash cans, and in outbuildings, there was no garden. Overcrowding became less extreme after the turn of the century, with 2.2 people per room in 1930. By then, the percentage of houses with fewer than 6 residents had increased to 25%. However, it was still a far cry from the acceptable living conditions we have today, as described by a housing inspector in the 1920s, Nana Brosh, in her book. The door cannot be closed because the table and stroller must stand in front, pressed against the wall. We squeeze in. There isn't much space to move around. The bench, the dresser, the table, and the stroller, a stool and the cooking stove take up half the space, and we, 2 people, occupy the rest. She showed me that in the evening, the table and stroller had to be swapped out for the mattress. We have to cook and wash in the same spot, even while the child has been sick. Water, light, and transport. When the city expanded in 1878, and Rodeløkka and other suburbs were incorporated into Christiania, the city residents complained about the costs this would incur. The suburbs were unregulated and lacked even proper water supply. Rodeløkka's water supply was particularly poor, and people had to fetch all their drinking water from public fountains as far away as Lakkagata School. Sofienbergbekken stream, which ran through the valley between Langata and Tramsagata, probably functioned as a drain for wastewater since there was no regulated sewage system. Likely to improve sanitary conditions, Sofienbergbekken was placed in pipes in 1880. In 1885, Rodeløkka and Kampen were provided with regulated water supply from Maridalsvannet. This involved a water pipe being branched off to Rodeløkka, and then it was up to the homeowners to use it. According to the land registry, some homeowners installed a water post outside their house, but it wasn't until well into the 20th century that several houses had running water. Outdoor toilets were also common until the sanitation decree was lifted around 1980. When conservation and rehabilitation were prioritized, the municipality introduced toilet support for all those rehabilitating their houses to 1930 standards, which included a bathroom and WC. Initially, the suburb of Rodeløkka had no street lighting, but after its incorporation, 60 oil lamps were distributed to the new suburbs. By the end of 1886, these areas collectively had 227 oil lamps and 86 gas lamps. Another problem that was gradually solved was the lack of communication lines to the other city districts. The first access to Grünerløkka came via Rakkisgata to Sofienbergata and then to Toftesgata, which was completed in 1877. The second connection to Grünerløkka was the construction of Helgesensgata after 1884. The street connection between Rodeløkka and Torshov was finished in 1899. In 1900, 25 years after Christiania Tramway Company was established, Rodeløkka was connected to the tramline to the city centre. The route ran from Egetorget, and the terminus was Carl Berner's Place, then a rural outpost with a great view of the hills to the west. The streets get new names. When Rodeløkka was incorporated into Christiania, most of the streets had to change names. As a suburb outside the city, it had been free to choose any street names it liked, but unless these same street names existed in Christiania, and were thus taken, name changes were required. Only Langgata and Fdelgata were allowed to keep their original names because these names did not exist elsewhere in the city. Therefore, these two street names have remained unchanged since the early days of the wooden town. For the other streets, Smedgata, where the 3 blacksmiths were said to have lived, became Tromsøgata. Despite the extensive name changes, there were very few changes to the original street layout. Only a couple of small streets ceased to exist in the following decades. The suburb's largest school. There was a school in Rodeløkka throughout the suburb period, and it was established on Göteborggata in 1860. There was no requirement that children had to attend the school they were assigned to, but it seems that almost all the children from Rodeløkka attended the local school. In 1875, there were 667 children of school age, 7 to 14 years, living in Rodeløkka, and the year before, 643 children had enrolled at the Rodeløkka school. Boys' gangs and territories. A characteristic and legendary feature of the child-rich suburbs until the war years was the formation of boys' gangs, who fiercely guarded their territories. These gangs would often get into brawls, sometimes even fighting regular battles. According to one of the informants, there were frequent fights between the boys from Rodeløkka and Rodeløkka, and it also happened that they fought with the boys from Campen. Martinson notes that the boys' gangs' eagerness to defend their territories is a testament to the strong identity of the area. This is one of several pieces of evidence that people in the suburbs viewed them as separate from the other city neighbourhoods. Local institutions. Initially, Rodeløkka had only one institution, the school established on Göteborg Gata in 1860. The local church was completed in 1877 and named Petrus Church. The same year, Rodeløkka police station was established in a Swiss-style wooden house at Tromsø Gata 4. The building still stands today. The police district included the area north of Helgesensgata up to Rosenhof, the area around Tvergata on Torshov, and the area between Trondheimsveien, Toftsgata, and Fagerheim Gata. The fire and postal districts were shared by Rodeløkka and Grünerløkka. In 1880, a so-called daycare was established, where working mothers could leave their children during the day. In 1907, an old age home and a community garden were established. A sports ground at Dalenenga was decided upon in 1910, and a public bath was built in 1912. The bath was an outdoor pool that was only open in the summer. The water in Rodeløkka's bath was notorious for being cold, and it was closed down long before the war. It's noteworthy that the church and the new school did not bear the name of the district but were named Petrus Church and Sophienberg School, unlike institutions in other neighborhoods. However, it seems that the people of Rodeløkka also felt a strong local affiliation. They experienced the area as a small village of its own. One could stand at the top of Torshovdalen and look down on it. Still, the absence of a Rodeløkka church and Rodeløkka school after 1883 likely resulted in weaker branding of the district in the minds of the citizens of Christiania compared to Campen, Vålerenga, and Sagene. This is probably one of the reasons why the name Rodeløkka is not as well ingrained in the city's consciousness as the other three districts. The workers' movement also likely played a significant role in the organizational life, as, in the early decades of the 20th century, it was very focused on organizing workers politically, athletically, culturally, and socially. As Rodeløkka increasingly became a working-class district in line with the growing significance of industrialization in the city, much of the organizational life likely took place within the workers' movement. Economic activity. Although Rodeløkka was primarily a residential area, there was some business activity from the start. Craftsmen operated small businesses in the district, including several quicksmiths who settled in the 1860s and specialized in a single product, such as locks and door handles. They produced these items in large numbers and could therefore sell them cheaply. This suggests a transition from small craft businesses to industry. The blacksmiths operated professionally and had their products displayed in windows, possibly for retail. In 1875, several residents of Rodeløkka were engaged in independent trade, operating food stores and milk shops. These stores may have been located outside Rodeløkka, but as the population grew, we can assume that a market for food stores also emerged in the district. A greenhouse was established in the upper part of Rodeløkka in the mid-1870s, when a gardener named Nilsson, described as a diligent and skilled businessman, moved to the area. Here he built one of the country's most significant flower nurseries at the time. Only 4 residents of Rodeløkka worked at Nilsson's greenhouse in 1875, which supports the assumption that most residents found work outside the district. In the upper part of Rodeløkka, there were also stables and slaughterhouses, but it's unlikely many were employed in these businesses. More typical were small family or individual-run businesses. One of Martinson's informants recalls a woman named Grise-Lisa who lived at the top of Fjellgata, where the dairy factory was later established, and made a living from raising pigs. Her pigs roamed freely on the hill. In Fjellgata, there was also a family that ran a small farm until 1917. In the small farmyard on the hill, the family had a tiny stable with stalls for 4 cows, recalls one of Martinson's informants. They also had 2 sheep and 16 hens. The stable had another floor where the feed was stored. There was also a stone quarry along the ridge of Fjellgata, but it wasn't a large workplace. Apparently, older and physically disabled people who couldn't participate in regular work tried to earn a modest income by breaking stones, which likely didn't improve their health or their finances. Industrial workplaces. As the 19th century progressed, factories were established on Rodeløkka. The district was almost split in two, with small businesses and workshops as well as milk stores in the wooden houses along Trondheimsveien, while brick houses in Goatborgata and Dalenenga were both residences and factories. By 1915, there were 6 factories in the district with more than 100 workers, along with a number of smaller businesses. These were mostly in the food and beverage industry and mechanical industries. The largest was the Fria chocolate factory on Goatborgata, which had 850 workers in 1936. Just next door was the Bergine chocolate factory, which employed 126 workers. Rodeløkka takes on a bygone feel. The character of Rodeløkka as a small, isolated village within the city was dramatically shaken when the construction of apartment blocks under public administration began on Dalenengata. This happened in the 1930s and must be seen in the context of the old buildings in Vika being demolished at the same time. People were being provided with better places to live. Rodeløkka residents found it strange to suddenly have so many new people living close by, as they were not used to that. The residents of the wooden houses knew everything about each other, but now there were many new faces that were harder to relate to. As one of Martinson's informants expresses it, Rodeløkka was a small community to itself, all the way up to the 1930s. At this time, there was also some out-migration from Rodeløkka. Newly built apartment blocks on Torshov enticed people with their modern apartments, and the increasingly dilapidated wooden buildings took on a bygone feel. It wasn't all idyllic, both in terms of the living conditions and the social environment. Overcrowding was notably prevalent, and Rodeløkka wasn't spared from the large social problems of the time, such as widespread alcohol abuse and growing unemployment. One of the apartment buildings on the hill was called the Triple Hell due to the drinking, fighting, and overall unpleasantness that prevailed there. During dry law, there was large-scale alcohol trafficking. Despite Rodeløkka developing a poor reputation, people in the district seemed to think that it wasn't any worse here than in other areas. The authorities' ambitions to combat poverty and move ordinary people into modern apartments with water and sewage were among the optimistic visions put forward by the country's first viable Labour Party government. All along new tall red brick apartment blocks began to appear in a row. It seemed the days of the wooden houses on Rodeløkka were numbered. A precursor to the suburbs? Solveig Martinson asks whether the suburb of Rodeløkka could be considered a precursor to the post-war suburbs. An important difference is that Rodeløkka developed spontaneously and was unwanted, as a headache for the authorities in the 1860s and 70s, while the post-war suburbs were desired and carefully planned as the solution to the ongoing housing shortage. However, there are striking similarities. Rodeløkka had a school as early as 1860, and there were some workplaces, likely with shops and service establishments, so it cannot be considered a purely bedroom community. The suburb became a small community of its own, with its own institutions and some degree of business activity, even though it was far from self-sufficient. This is also a characteristic of the suburbs. Martinson points out that Rodeløkka emerged at a time when the city's population was growing rapidly, and there was a housing shortage, which mirrors the situation after the war. In this light, it seems that the suburb solution arose spontaneously at the grassroots level long before the authorities embraced the same idea and began developing actual suburban areas. Perhaps Rodeløkka can be seen as an 1800s version of a suburb, more than 100 years before the concept was fully accepted and embraced by the authorities. Through years Rodeløkka became a typical working-class neighbourhood, and throughout the 1900s, it was perceived as a rather slum area. In previous urban development plans the district, just as many other historical areas in Oslo, was regulated for demolition, cynically called sanitation, and new construction. Luckily, it didn't happen, so we have a chance to get a glimpse of the old Oslo vibe. The threat of demolition led many homeowners to neglect the maintenance of their houses since they would be sanitized anyway, which further contributed to the deterioration of the area. However, in the early 1970s, many houses were purchased or rented by students and other young people who saw the neighborhood as idyllic for them and could find affordable housing here in otherwise a less prestigious area. They initiated campaigns against demolition and received support from public cultural heritage organizations and private institutions such as the Society for the Preservation of Norwegian Ancient Monuments and the Society for the Preservation of Oslo's Cultural and Architectural Heritage. Many of the houses were renovated and got modern sanitary facilities, and these improvements helped influence public opinion and municipal politicians to advocate for preservation. After the Architecture Conservation Year in 1975, total sanitation was no longer politically feasible. The remaining 137 wooden houses in the area were listed as worthy of preservation in 1988. Thank you for joining me today for a walk in this very special site in Oslo. If you enjoyed this online tour, please consider pressing the like button and subscribe to my channel. This helps a lot. And if you want to support my work, there is a link for a one-time donation in description of this video. Thank you and see you soon in my future virtual walks.